All right, welcome to actual Fusion 360. This is the video where we're going to be covering the interface. I know it's going to be a little bit dry, but I promise you that videos in the future won't be as bad as this. But what's covered in here is actually really important foundational information about how Fusion 360 works. So I'm going to try and go through it as quickly as possible, and I'm going to step over stuff that I don't think is important or you won't understand until you know some future stuff. Okay, first, starting in the top left corner, as you can see, we've got this little grid over here. This is where all of the projects and stuff that you save within Fusion 360 will go. By default, you should have a variety of different folders in here, including some samples and stuff down at the bottom. These projects over here, you can save a variety of different files within them. Plus, you can set up the project to be shared with other people. So if you double click on it, it'll take you into the project. And within that, as you can see up here at the top, we've got a data tab, and it'll show all of the items that are within that. And then you can also share it with other people. So you can type in somebody's email address, hit invite, and that will give them access to everything that's in here. However, if you just want to share a single thing with a single person, or with a variety of people because it's a public link, what you can always do is you can do share public link, and even if it isn't a shared folder with anybody else, you can just give this file to them, and they'll be able to open it up in their own version of Fusion 360. All of this stuff is synced up with the cloud, so if you were to log into Fusion 360 via your account on another computer, all of these items will be able to be downloaded on that other computer. So if you're on a hot desk, for instance, or you're going back and forth between school and home, you can save stuff into these folders and be able to open it up in both places, which is actually super useful. All right, in here, as you can see, we've got test projects, my test project, which I just made previously. So I'm going to click this new project button. You'll add a new name for it, and then you can easily set it up for sharing with additional other people if you want to. You can create folders, you can organize all your stuff. This works just like a file system, except it's on the internet, and honestly, I don't actually use it that much. I prefer to save stuff locally, which is what I'm going to cover next. As you can see over here, this is where we can add a new design. So you press this new design button or Control N as it's showing here, and what it'll do is it will open up a new document for you. You can have multiple open at the same time via this little tab up here at the top. If we click this new design button, which is also over here, as you can see, it's opened up a new document also called Untitled. And we can switch them back and forth between the two documents at the same time in Fusion 360, which is actually super useful. Also down here, we've got drawings. So this is for exporting like a blueprint that you would give to, say, a machinist or somebody who's looking over your work. We'll be covering this later on, but this is basically just allowing you to create dimensioned output printable drawings of whatever you've made. Super useful. You've also got electronics design and stuff in here. Not covering it in this course. I've actually never used it before, but it is something that Fusion 360 can do. We've also got drawing templates. This is related to drawings. I'm not going to cover that for now. This is how you could open a document that's saved on your computer if you want to, and I think you can also see stuff that are saved in the different folders over on the left. So as you can see, test project is right there, as well as all of the other previous projects that we've got. So this is just like a new list that also sort of replicates what's over in that tab over on the right. But you can also open stuff out of your computer, for instance, in here too. So if we go open, you can click open from computer. So if you've got an exported file, one of these F3D files here, you could open this and it'll open it right here in Fusion 360 for you. Further down, we've got save. You know how save works. Save, interestingly here, if we hit save, it'll say, hey, what do you want to name this? We can call this Devin's Project, like this. And now, as you can see, it's called Devin's Project version 0, and we can't hit the save button up here because we haven't made any changes to it. If you do go in and make a change to it, so I'm just going to draw a plane here real quick. Now I hit the save button. As you can see, this thing is going to get updated to Devin's Project V2, and you'll be able to see a version history really nicely saved of your project and any changes that were made day to day. So if we go back over here and we take a look at Devin's Project, you can say, oh, there's Devin's Project 1, Devin's Project 2, and if you click on Devin's Project 1, you can actually open that. So now it's going to open up Devin's Project V1 before we drew the square, and you can get like a really nice version history that's just all saved here nicely for you. So that's actually pretty useful. I'm going to close this guy again. Most of the time I have this thing closed. As you can see, it takes up sort of a lot of screen space. Okay, now further down here, we've also got the export button. This is a super useful button. If you want to email a document to somebody because they don't have Fusion 360 set up for doing internet things or something like that, you can just go in here and you can export an F3D file. This is the default Fusion 360 format, and it will do all the things that you can get if you just hit the regular save button over here on the left, and you
basically able to say open it up on somebody else's computer. So all the timeline, all the parts of it, and all that kind of stuff will actually be saved in this file. In addition to that, there's also a few other files down here that are really useful. However, there's a big caveat with this, and it's one of my least favorite things about Fusion 360, and that a lot of these files you actually have to export to the Fusion 360 cloud to convert them. So if I were to say, I want an OBJ file, and I do that, it's going to say, hey, this type requires cloud translation. It may take a few minutes. And when they say a few minutes, it actually means like 20 minutes. It takes a really, really long time to do it, and I don't recommend it. Okay, so if we were to do that, what will happen is it'll show up over here in the Job Status tab, and you'll be able to watch a little loading bar of your project being converted. Even if it's a super simple project, if you model a thumbtack and you want to export it as an OBJ, it's going to take 20 minutes. It's really, really annoying. So I don't recommend doing that. There are some file formats in here, however, within this export that are done locally. So for instance, I think step files are one of them. Also, what are the STL files are one of them as well. But I think STL might actually say, oh, yeah, we do have to do that. But there's a little caveat on that one. So if we were to, once again, draw something on this plane, I'm just going to do this real quick like this. We go finish drawing, and then we apply a feature to it so that it is actually a 3D model. Now what we can do is we can right-click on this body, and you can go save as mesh. This is another export. As you can see, here's STL. This one, however, does it locally. So if you're ever exporting an STL from Fusion 360, this is how I would recommend doing it. Don't do it via the export menu. Just FYI. Okay, moving along. Most of this stuff I don't ever use, so I'm just going to skip it. All right, you got your save button. Already showed you that. And then we've also got undo and redo up at the top. As you can see, there's a drop down. So you can undo like a really long way if you want to. So you can go back to undo, create sketch, and this will go through your entire project, and it'll undo everything, and now we're back at the beginning. But as you can see, it also animated it for us, and we could see all of the things that were happening there, which is useful, maybe. I don't know. Or it'll just take a long time. I don't know. Notifications, almost never used it. Extensions, super useful. I don't use it that often, but if you're doing a repeated task, there is a very good likelihood that somebody has made a script which will make it easier for you. So this is actually kind of a cool place to like wander around in and see what people have out there. Like I said, it's really good if you're doing a repeated task. Somebody will have written a script that will automate that task for you, and that's sort of what this is. That's sort of what this is for. Job status, told you about that. Notification center, never click on it. Help, this is if you want information about it, so you can type it in and look it up there at the top. A whole bunch of different stuff, but this is what this video is for. So like, hopefully you don't need help by the time we're done with this. Then we've also got your Autodesk account, your profile, so you can look at your settings and stuff, but also preferences for Fusion 360 are also hidden up over here. And there's actually a pretty good variety of really useful stuff in here. Some of them that you'll find yourself wanting to turn on and off because you think it's really annoying. So for instance, allow 3D sketching of lines and splines is turned off by default, but I would highly recommend you have it turned on because there's another setting in the interface that lets you do that or turn it on and off really easily. So turning this on is something that I would recommend doing. Just like tick it. If your box is unticked, click that one and say, we'll probably cover it again later, but it's actually a really useful thing in certain cases. Okay, next over here we have our manager. I think this is called the browser. I always call it the manager. This is where all of the parts of your project are going to be stored. So what we're looking at here is actually a hierarchy. We've got one component added into our document here. If we have multiple components, we'll see another thing that says test, that says whatever the name of the component is, and we'll have a symbol like this next to it. And then there's also a little radio button, and that will allow you to activate different components within it. We'll cover more of that later. Don't worry about it. We've got document settings over here, which allows you to change your units. So if you're a gringo, you probably want to set this to inches if you want. And you want to do that before you get into your document. Otherwise, all your dimensions will get changed on you, and it's really annoying. So just watch out for that. Named views, so you can view stuff from the top if you want to. You can view stuff from home. You can view stuff from the right. But basically, these are just saved camera views of your document, and there's always going to be these four in there by default, but you can always add additional ones later on. Underneath it, we have our origin. So I'm going to go back to my home view here so we can actually see it. If we click on it here, as you can see, there are 3 default planes. So if we hit the drop down right here, these are referring to these 3 planes. We'll get more into what all of this means here in a sec, but for now, just know that this is here. This is actually really useful, and this is sort of the
area that you should be building your entire document around. You don't want to like build it in a corner. You want to build around the center of it. Okay, so these are the folders that are currently in here. However, if you add additional other things up here, so for instance, if we added a sketch to our scene, a sketch folder would show up. Or if we added an extrude and created a bodies folder would show up. You've also got analysis folders if you want. You've also got construction folders. And then you've also got like these canvas folders. So for instance, if you had dropped in a background, that would show up in here as well. And that's where all of that stuff gets stored. Along the top, we have a variety of different tabs. We're mostly going to be sticking to solids, though I might dabble a little bit into surfaces a little bit later on. Surfaces are a little bit more complicated than solids, and in most cases, people are just building solids in here, or at least in my experience. Surfaces are mostly for creating like injection molded types of parts, or parts that are not solid on the inside, as the name might imply. These are objects that are mostly surfaces. So for instance, like you could say like a bottle of shampoo or something, you know, it's technically a solid object because the walls have thickness, but for the most part, it's most easily represented as surfaces because it's got a big cavity on the inside of it, in which case you'd probably want to be designing it with surfaces as opposed to starting with a solid and then coring it out. So just know that this is here. It's really useful for stuff, but that's a little bit outside of the scope of this course, I think. Then we've got our mesh. This is for importing stuff from other programs. So if you design this in a polygon modeling program or something like that, you can import these in here. Sometimes they'll work, sometimes they won't, because they are not solid objects. We'll get a little bit more into that later. But also, this is notably how you'd work with STL files that you import in here, because technically they're being converted from the solid model concept over into a bunch of triangles, basically, that you could re-import in here. So if you downloaded an STL off the internet and working with it in Fusion 360, this is some of the tools that'll be useful to you. We've got sheet metal, never used it, not saying it's not important, but I've never used it before. And then we've also got tools up here at the top. You'll notice that some of these tools are actually the same thing that you can see in this inspect folder over here. So this is sort of just once you're done with your project and you're taking a look at it and making sure everything is nice and tidied up and stuff. This is where some of those tools are going to be for you. All right, so we've got solid here. Like I said, this is where most of what we're going to be doing is in. The first button over here is create sketch. Probably the button you'll hit the most in Fusion 360, if I had to say. Very, very useful button. Next to it, we've got two of the features that get used the most. There's actually four important features that you'll use very, very frequently. But these are the two that you'll probably end up using the most. Then we've got a hole button. I don't use hole that often. Useful in certain cases, but I prefer to make them with drawn things. And then next to it, we've also got pattern. Pattern's actually really useful, and I actually use it all the time. There's a variety of different ones, but what they've done here is they've sort of put these buttons up here at the top because they think they're the ones that you will be using the most. However, that might not actually be true. So for instance, create form. Do we actually use create form that much? Probably not. So what you can do is you can always unpin it. So you unclick pin from pin to toolbar, and now you've got another space you can put another tool you use more frequently. So for instance, I use mirror all the time, so I'm going to pin mirror up here at the top. The same thing is true over here. These are tools that you'd use after you've already created bodies. So after you've used some of these tools to generate geometry based on the sketches that you're making, these tools will modify that geometry. So like being able to round off a corner, being able to press and pull a surface, make it bigger or smaller, all that kind of stuff is in here. It's really useful. Then there's also change parameters down here at the bottom, which is sort of like a bit of a non-traditional tool, but is one of my favorite things in Fusion 360, and I absolutely love it. And there will be an entire chapter dedicated to just this button here, so much so that I usually have it pinned up here at the top. So I'm just going to pin my change parameters thing up there at the top, and we'll go over that later on. Next, we've got assemblies. I love how Fusion 360 handles assemblies. It's wonderful. You don't have two different file types. It's just really well managed, in my opinion, unlike some other CAD software, SolidWorks. That just don't do as good a job on it. All right, and then we've got our construction planes. This is for creating surfaces that you can draw on. There's a whole bunch included with this. We'll cover it later. It's going to be its own chapter.
And we've also got the inspect menu. I mostly use measure and I mostly use section analysis in here. Both of those are super useful and we'll be covering them later, of course. Next, we've got insert. This is also really useful if you're working off of something that exists in real life. So for instance, you've drawn something and you want to convert it into Fusion 360. This is the menu you do it with via this canvas here. So you can take a picture of whatever you've drawn, put the canvas in Fusion 360, and then you can basically trace over it. We've also got insert derive. So if you've made it something in another Fusion 360 file and you want to put it in this one, you'd hit this button and we'll bring it in. You've also got decals, which will allow you to put things on the surface of objects. So for instance, this Autodesk logo on the side of a knife or whatever this is, that's how you do that. We've also got insert SVG. So if you made something in Illustrator via splines, you can import it straight into here, which is really good if you're like trying to etch a logo into the surface of something. You can design it in Illustrator and then just re-import it in here, which is great. DXF, which is a type of drawing file. Honestly, don't use this button very much. McMaster Car, super useful. I don't use it that much, but I know it's actually really important for other people. So for instance, if you're using standardized bolts and nuts and screws and washers and blah, 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 any of that kind of like little metal paraphernalia, basically what this is a giant catalog of all that kind of stuff. And it is massive. So just for virtually everything you can think of, they're going to have multiple different types of it. So for instance, we're like screws and bolts. I use those all the time. All right, as you can see, there's 17,000 different types of screws and bolts in here at a whole bunch of different thread sizes, and you can basically just pick one out. So you'd be like, well, I want this one here, and then you go add to project. Where's the add to project button? I think it's actually hidden underneath the side of my window here, and I can't see it, which is kind of annoying. Let's see here. I have selected too much. Cool. So now what you can do is you can click download unsupported file format. Please try step format file. Oh, I see. It's set to SolidWorks right now. If we go step and then we click download, what it'll do is it'll automatically drop it here into our document, and we can reuse it over and over and over just as a component. So as you can see, it's been added as a component as a child of our main component here. I'm not going to actually do that for now, but it's a good thing to know that is there, and it'll save you a whole bunch of time so you don't have to like design screws or whatever in your document. Next, we've got insert mesh. Like I said, this is from if you're using an STL, for instance, that's a really good case for it. But also if you're working in like Blender or Maya or 3ds Max or Cinema 4D or something, what you can do is you can insert meshes from those programs. However, those programs don't force you to create solids like SolidWorks does, and sometimes the meshes you import will be broken. You have to fix them. So just be careful of that, especially when you're downloading stuff off the internet. Some people just do a terrible job. So, just know that. And then we've also got manufacturer parts and other parts. So these are also sort of similar to this McMaster Car thing. I almost never use these buttons though. I think I may have used it like once in the like 5 years I've been using SolidWorks. I mean Fusion 360, excuse me. All right, and then we've got select. I almost never use this guy either, but that has never bothered me. All right, now down here at the bottom, we have an extremely, extremely important tool. This is the timeline. As you can see down here, if we were to put something into our document. So let's say I'm going to draw a sketch here. I'm going to put my rectangle in again. Now, as you can see, a sketch has been put down here. What this is going to do is it's going to show a chronological order of all of the things that you've added to your document. So for instance, now if I were to apply a feature to this, which we'll get into later. Don't worry if you don't understand what's going on here. Now, as you can see, it said, oh, we added an extrude to it. Now, let's say we grabbed the end of it and we moved it. And we go, okay. Now, what it'll do is it'll show, hey, you did a press pull. Actually, it doesn't show that we did a press pull. This is a special tool. But if we added something else, so for instance, we got this and we say, okay, let's add a shell to this. Now shell will show up down here. And most of the things that you can grab out of here, as you can see, not absolutely everything, but most things that you can grab out of here will show up as a feature down here in the bottom. Now, it's really good to be able to see that kind of stuff so you can track what's happening in your project, but also what's really important is that you can go back and edit stuff. So for instance, what we can do is we can go back and edit our sketch. So you can say, oh, well, actually, I wanted this thing to be bigger. We go finish sketch. And now, as you can see, everything that's been added to it has been applied to the sketch that we did at the beginning. So we're ending up with like this parametric thing where we start with some dimensions and then another thing gets added to it and another thing gets added to it, and everything's based on the previous thing that happened. So for instance, with this this shell that we added here, as you can see, when we adjusted the size of the drawing that we began with, the shell automatically readapted to that. It wasn't like cut off on the end or something like that. It's just saying, okay, based on the size of this extrude, I'm going to shell this far away from the side of it. And the extrude is, regardless of how big this sketch is, we're going to extrude it up this distance. And basically what it lets you do is it allows you to like stack features that you're adding to it and go back in time and adjust things that happened earlier. And what it'll do is it'll sequentially update everything that happened afterwards. And it's a super, super useful feature and probably the most important reason to use CAD. A lot of other programs don't allow you to do this. Most CAD programs do, but most other programs don't. So for instance, if you're using Rhino or something like that, you don't have that version history, and it can be actually kind of frustrating in my opinion. The same thing is also true for polygon modelers. They have other advantages over this. Like this is not like the perfect 3D program for doing absolutely everything, but these are really, really spectacular features, and I highly recommend you take advantage of it. I would say that as far as CAD goes, this is probably one of the most important features that's included with it, because a lot of this 3D modeling stuff you can do in virtually every program, but this timeline sort of concept is special to like SolidWorks and Fusion 360 and stuff, and is easily one of the most important and best features of it. Okay, also here in the bottom center, if you are using a mouse, you'll find yourself using these buttons more often. So if we click on this, we can orbit around it. However, and then you can hit escape to get out of it. However, what I would recommend doing is just use a mouse, because it'll make your life much easier. It's much easier to click. If you find yourself pinching to zoom in on things, you're gonna kind of hate yourself in Fusion 360. In my opinion, it's much easier with the mouse. So for instance, I can do shift middle click, and what I'll do is I'll have that same orbit button rather than clicking on it and dragging around. Shift middle click. Zooming is really easy as well. So we just, oh man, zooming is just scroll wheel, and then we've also got pan, which is middle click. So I'm just clicking that middle mouse button, and it'll get you around your scene much easier than trying to do it with the trackpad, because most trackpads don't have a middle click button on them. Being able to middle click is like one of the most important things with Fusion 360 in my opinion. All right, so now we've also got look at here, which will allow you to grab a sketch, for instance, and we can look at it. So if we hit that, what it'll do is it'll take you to like a planar view of it. The planar view is really useful because it's like a perspectiveless, for the most part, view. Sometimes you'll get perspective in your scene. You don't want that. So just for what it's worth, you'll know when you see it. You'll get like foreshortening if you like make a cube. If we set this to perspective mode, as you can see here, we're getting foreshortening where we can like see these edges here, which is actually really, really annoying. So I would recommend sticking with orthographic almost always here in SolidWorks. There's like some cases where you need perspective, like if you're trying to do a screenshot for somebody, but for the most part, I almost always have it in orthographic, as that gives me like the most accurate measurements in our document. Down here, we've also got zoom. So for instance, if you want to zoom in on one particular thing, you can click that button, which is great. Display settings, a lot of these things we're not going to understand until we get further in, so I'll cover that later. Then we've got our grid settings here. So for instance, this sort of like gray grid that we can see in the background is coming from this. If we hit that button, it'll disappear. You can turn it back on. You can also turn on snap to grid. So for drawing, you can sort of like lock to the corners of this. Plus you can set the grid. So you can say currently it's set to adaptive, which means if we zoom in and out, the grid will get more dense or less dense depending on how far we are. So as you can see, there's a transition that happens right there. So it's one square gets split to 4 as we zoom in. That's what adaptive means. If we've got it set to fixed, for instance, now it's just going to put one grid line every 5 inches, regardless of how much you're zoomed in or zoomed out on this thing. Plus, as you can see, you've got your measurements over here on the left. So we're seeing 0 to 5, and then it's putting a grid in, then 10, another grid, and so on and so forth. Most of the time, I just have it set to adaptive. Sometimes it's useful to be able to snap to the grid, but for the most part, I just dimension stuff manually, and we'll cover more about that later if you don't know what that means. Okay, anyway, then you've also got quad view. So if you want to, you can go to multiple views. What we're taking a look at here is this is our 3D view, so we can rotate around it. This one is stuck in top view. This one is stuck in front view, though as you can see here, you can change it if you want to, and you can look at your object from 4 different angles all at the same time. Currently, my box disappeared. Oh, nope, there it is. It's just super tiny. And as you can see here, we can see 4 different views of it. So we're looking at it from the right, we're looking at it from the front. No, this is the front. This is looking at it from the right. If we click, we can see right in the top corner, and then this is looking at it from the top. So you can go through all of these different views. You can look at it in 4 different ways. Most of the time I have this set to single view because I think that this little widget up here in the corner makes it really easy to look at all of the different views anyway, and you can just like move around it super easily, and it's great. So most of the time I don't do this 4-view thing, and I don't think it's quite as important as other software like maybe Rhino or something like that, whereas like you rely on the 4-view a whole lot, but in Fusion 360 I find navigating is a lot easier, so I don't need it. Which brings me to the gumball up here, sorry, not the gumball, the view cube up in the top corner. We've got our home button, which will take us back to this 3/4 view, which we defaulted into when we opened up our document in the first place. You can reset that if you want to. So for instance, if you're like, well, I want my home view to actually be like looking at it from the front, what we can do is we can go down here and set current view as home, and we can click fit to view. Now if we were to rotate this thing around, we can go like this and it'll automatically snap back to this. If you decide you didn't like that, you can hit the reset home button over here, and now it'll take us back to the 3/4. I hit this home button a lot, and I mostly almost always have it set to this 3/4 view, as it's really, really useful for doing extrusions. If you're trying to extrude something when you're looking straight at it, it's really hard to tell how much you've extruded it. So I'd mostly keep it like this. And we got top. We got the sides, we got corners that we can click on here. We can look at it from an angle if we want to. All these different views are really useful, and I actually use them fairly frequently, and I find that this is one of the best ways to rotate around my scene. I mostly avoid the shift middle click thing. I mostly just like click on this thing to drag it. But that's just me. You know, you can do it however you want. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. Sorry if this video ran on a little bit long, but I was trying to be as thorough as possible. And that's most of the interface stuff I'm going to talk about. Most of it's going to be actually making stuff and building stuff here in the future. And that'll be in the next video. We're going to be taking a look at the four-step process for making virtually everything in Fusion 360. So I'll see you in that video in a minute.